What are you, crazy?
No. I'm just marking my territory.
There isn't any room at the top for local girls like us.
I'm not giving up.
In the land of opportunity,
They're not gonna give you no shot test. They're gonna shoot you.
where dreams are won and lost,
Not long after completing his first feature film, Mike Nichols' 1988 comedy drama, Working Girl, newly minted film producer Douglas Wick got a call from none other than Indiana Jones himself, Harrison Ford, who told Wick that he wanted to take the lead in an epic western, a notion likely spurred by the classic genre's recent resurgence. And for the script, Ford pointed the producer to the great American poet and novelist, Jim Harrison. Although Harrison was by any measure a prolific writer and master of multiple forms, by the late 1980s he had only just begun to dabble in screenwriting, the 1989 crime comedy Cold Feet being his one and only feature credit at that point. So when a young Hollywood producer approached him about writing a blockbuster western for Harrison Ford, he was more than happy to oblige. Unfortunately, despite their best efforts, Ford's gunslinging star vehicle never came to fruition. But as it turned out, the experience wasn't a total loss for Wick, as one bizarre conversation with Harrison couldn't escape his mind, the wild-eyed author having spun the producer one howl of a story. 15 years earlier, on the night of a bright full moon, Harrison claimed that he was alone at his cabin on the Upper Michigan Peninsula when he underwent what he described as a lunar psychosis, one in which hair came up all over his body and an animal-like snout protruded from his face, also alleging that he ripped the cabin doors off their hinges, and added that his dog was leery of him for a week after. Regardless of its legitimacy, from this hairy scenario, the writer conceived of a fantastical story, that of a man trapped in the clutches of civilization, and specifically, high society, whose inner animal would soon be let out. Wick was nothing short of enthralled by this concept and wasted no time in once again recruiting Harrison to pen the screenplay, and chose to move far and away from Working Girl and the Old West, and instead delve straight into the world of the supernatural thriller, aiming to craft a werewolf story like no moviegoer had seen before. An urban dark fairy tale that took on the shape of a big-budget Hollywood production and featured Oscar-caliber talent both in front of and behind the camera, resulting in a one-of-a-kind thinking man's monster movie that offered up classical filmmaking subverted by some genuine bite.
Inside a man he's entered until the first full moon. And then he consumes him, killing all but his nature and his heart.
Not a great prognosis.
Douglas Wick knew that pitching a deconstructive werewolf movie was going to prove difficult if he didn't lock in a surefire Hollywood name to star. And as luck would have it, writer Jim Harrison was a longtime friend of arguably the biggest star in the world at that time, Jack Nicholson. The producer met with the unmistakable megastar at his Beverly Hills home with a copy of the first draft of Harrison's script in hand, and fortunately for Wick, Nicholson had actually been pining to play a werewolf for quite some time, and had also been trying to get a project in motion with Jim Harrison for nearly a decade. And so it's safe to say that the actor immediately took to the part. Although the role called for a reinvigorated company man, Nicholson was already well into middle age when cast as book editor Will Randall. and wasn't exactly a perfect match for the relatable everyman, although the character would evolve to suit the star's age, making him a past-his-prime professional. Nicholson had recently taken on a variety of colorful roles in box office hits like 1989's Batman and 1992's A Few Good Men, as well as the biopic Hoffa, although the latter was a financial flop, and Wolf would become yet another chance to demonstrate his versatility. Although some would argue that Nicholson's sometimes infamous animalistic nature meant that very little needed to be done to convince us that he was a werewolf. Nonetheless, the veteran actor's involvement would take the project in a much more prestigious direction. As a part of his contract, Nicholson was given final say in choosing the film's director, and first approached Stanley Kubrick about helming the project, but the esteemed auteur wasn't too keen on the idea of doing a monster movie and declined the offer. Undiscouraged, Nicholson next turned to one of his and Douglas Wick's other past collaborators, Oscar-winning filmmaker and Working Girl director Mike Nichols. Nichols was also known for delivering such Hollywood classics as The Graduate and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and had worked with Nicholson on 3 previous films between 1971 and 1986, with Woolf marking their 4th and final collaboration.
I think that if there is a difference, that we set ourselves something tough, which was that ideally you would look at our wolf picture and think, my God, this is really happening. This isn't Carpathia or some mountains in the Dolomites, some village in the Dolomites. This is really happening now, here.
By the early 1990s, the director was no doubt entering the later stage of his career, and was fresh off of the financially successful but poorly received 1991 drama regarding Henry, when producer Douglas Wick gave him a call about doing a werewolf movie with Jack Nicholson. Nichols saw the film as a chance to reinvent his career and make something unique within a well-worn genre, but would quietly remain nervous about the supernatural elements of the film, something far outside his wheelhouse.
You're never off in New York. Well, of course, people in LA only think they get to be off, but everybody has to be on all the time in New York. And it's such a merciless place, Publishing is so utterly merciless, Everybody gets a 1/4 inch leeway every day,
Interestingly, Jim Harrison had already published a novel titled Wolf in 1971, but despite being of no relation to the film, it is still often mistakenly cited as being its source material. Unfortunately, the author's masterful skills in novel writing did not translate to screenwriting, and by the time Nichols boarded the film, the script had ballooned to over 150 pages and was overstuffed with uncinematic passages, internal dialogue, and flowery description, Harrison essentially having created something Nichols couldn't direct. And by 1992, the author decided it was best to simply exit the production, citing his creative differences with the director and studio. On his clash with Nichols, Harrison later stated, quote, "I wanted Dionysian, but he wanted Apollonian. He took my wolf and made it into a chihuahua. I cracked up for 10 minutes and then went out into the country and stood in front of a wolf den and apologized while my dog hid under the truck." Harrison, in fact, grew to hate the film and the industry that produced it, to the extent that he soon after abandoned Hollywood altogether. Following Harrison's untimely resignation, Nichols' former comedy partner, playwright and actor Elaine May, was recruited to make significant revisions to Harrison's script. And while her contributions went uncredited in the final film, much of its levity can certainly be attributed to May's influence.
You kidding? You can smell it a mile away.
To make sense of Harrison's work in progress, Script doctor Wesley Strick was next brought on board to reshape the screenplay into something more filmable, Nichols telling the young writer, quote, "I want you to write me scenes that I can direct." Despite Nichols embracing a fresh pair of eyes, Strick knew that Harrison resented his involvement and that Jack Nicholson was also unhappy with the departure of his longtime friend. Fortunately, Strick found another ally in star Michelle Pfeiffer, who he had just worked with on 1992's Batman Returns. Strick would spend almost a year retooling the script, working directly with Nichols and Wick to pare it down to something meaner and leaner, also adding more satire and what he called New York humor to the film, although Strick did somewhat butt heads with Nichols when it came to themes and metaphors. The intellectual filmmaker was on record as seeing the story as an allegory for the then raging AIDS epidemic, as well as the, quote, death of God and the crumbling of Western civilization, while Strick, on the other hand, saw it for exactly what it was, a classy creature feature. Nonetheless, Mike Nichols wanted to subvert audience expectations by focusing the story on office politics and throwing in smart and witty dialogue that would help elevate the material.
What do you want?
And in fact, the word werewolf is never used once in the entire film, the writers instead using the term demon wolf to refer to Will's lycanthropy. In earlier incarnations, Will Randall was written to be a stereotypical New York lawyer at an upscale law firm, but Strick suggested that having him be a seasoned editor for a celebrated publishing company was not only less cliched, but provided the perfect environment for the dog-eat-dog storyline.
I'm gonna get you, Stuart.
Hot off the success of 1992's Basic Instinct, Sharon Stone was first approached to play Will's love interest and his boss's daughter, Laura Alden. But the busy star turned down the offer, and while Nichols and the producers auditioned several more actresses for the role, superstar Michelle Pfeiffer ultimately took on the part.
Because you're a good man. And that's very exotic to me. I never thought I'd meet a good man who looked at me the way you do.
With Pfeiffer's casting, Nichols initially considered beefing up the character's presence to give the star a little more to chew on. But Pfeiffer declined the gesture, admitting that she was honored enough to be working with the director and co-star Jack Nicholson. Although she and Nicholson had already shared the screen in 1987's The Witches of Eastwick. Pfeiffer was also eager to do a film set in a modern, everyday setting after having just completed 2 back-to-back period pieces which were preceded by a fantastical comic book movie. On the nature of the character, producer Douglas Wick described Laura Alden as a lost woman of privilege, while Pfeiffer interpreted her as a person drawn to wounded animals, as well as representing the growing beast within Will. The film does not reveal exactly how Laura becomes infected by the demon wolf as revealed in the closing scene, although it is suggested that a combination of the natural wildness within herself and her passionate love affair with Will are responsible. Others have surmised she was simply bitten by Stuart during his assault.
Were you bitten?
What an odd question. What a very odd question.
Despite their adversarial on-screen relationship, however, Pfeiffer and co-star James Spader became good friends during filming and carry on that friendship to this day. Spader's unique voice as an actor had a growing reputation in independent cinema in the early 1990s, and the star had also recently completed work on the 1993 erotic thriller Dream Lover, aligning him perfectly with the creepy sexuality needed for Will Randall's younger, power-hungry protege turned backstabbing werewolf, Stuart Swinton, the film's primary antagonist. Spader's performance as the slimy character is certainly a highlight of the film, and the actor clearly relished in the role, playing the kind of villain the audience loves to hate. And his unhinged, wolfier form is at moments genuinely frightening, as Stuart's transformed self becomes a much crueler killer than Will's wolf, who mirrors more animalistic attacks. On a more painful note, Spader's stuntman would be seriously injured after performing the shot where Stewart lands on the stone steps of the guest house. While the steps were lined with a thin protective padding, the stunt performer was launched off an air pad without the use of wires, and was knocked out cold after smacking his head against the stone, a shot that remains in the final film.
I never loved Stewart. It was a mistake, Will. I'm going to talk to him. Stewart never for one moment meant anything to me.
Rosemary's Baby star Mia Farrow was initially in talks to play the role of Will's unfaithful wife, Charlotte Randall. But at the time, the studio was nervous about the media firestorm over her legal battle against former boyfriend Woody Allen, and hesitated in her casting. Nevertheless, Farrow eventually eased their concerns by agreeing to take a significant pay cut, and therefore temporarily won the part. However, she eventually was forced to drop out anyway due to scheduling conflicts with her ongoing court appearances. Therefore, actor Kate Nelligan would take over the part shortly before filming began, perhaps best known for having played Lucy Westenra in John Badham's Dracula, and so it seemed only appropriate that she next be thrown to the wolves.
All right. Call it off. Keep your job. I'd never have fired you in the first place if I'd known you were this ruthless.
Thank you.
In earlier drafts of the script, billionaire publishing mogul Raymond Alden was written to be Laura's protective brother, with none other than Rolling Stones frontman Mick Jagger showing interest in the part. And at one point, Laura had even been written as Raymond's mistress. However, it was decided to make the character her father instead. While Marlon Brando was also looking to take over the role, award-winning actor Christopher Plummer was cast, producer Douglas Wick feeling Brando wasn't quite the right fit for the commanding presence needed for Alden.
Got an alibi. Girl says she was with him all night long.
Airtight?
Depends on who the girl turns out to be.
The film also enjoys a strong supporting cast, which includes Richard Jenkins as Detective Sergeant Carl Bridger, the actor having improvised several of his lines and told director Mike Nichols that he imagined Bridger wasn't very bright. Future Frasier star David Hyde Pierce plays Will's associate, Roy McAllister, alongside Dame Eileen Atkins as Mary.
It's about fucking time, sir.
And yet another future television star, David Schwimmer, was just a few months shy of the debut of Friends when he landed the tiny role of an unsuspecting New York police officer investigating a disturbance at the zoo. A brief appearance by Allison Janney marked her feature film debut.
Among my people, there is only one explanation for your symptoms. Is that you are becoming a wolf.
The late Indian character actor Ampuri would play Dr. Vijay Valazeus, the dying mystic Will seeks guidance from, a character added by Mike Nichols himself, who specifically wanted to homage Bela Lugosi's palm-reading character in Universal's The Wolfman. Because Valazeus is written to be a much older man, the then 44-year-old Puri had to be aged up by at least 20 years, an effect achieved with a simple stretch and stipple foundation paired with a foam latex bald cap with individually added hairs, reportedly a process the actor greatly enjoyed. And the Doctor's addition certainly helps align the film with more traditional werewolf storytelling.
It feels good to be wolf, doesn't it?
Fun fact, Will's surname, Randall, was chosen specifically for its etymology, being derived from the Old Norse name Ranulfur, later becoming Randvolf in Old English, which literally meant wolf shield. On an estimated budget of $70 million, the film was shot from mid-April to late July 1993, with principal photography taking place in both New York City and Long Island, including the Central Park Zoo. The exterior of Raymond Alden's estate was captured at Old Westbury Gardens in Nassau County, New York, in addition to a New York soundstage hosting Laura Alden's guest house. Nichols chose New York City as the film's backdrop because he wanted Will Randall to be a product of his environment, and considered New York to be the jungle of American cities. Although the majority of the film was shot on Hollywood soundstages, Will Randall's publishing office was filmed inside LA's famous Bradbury Building, a location that can be spotted in numerous other productions. Mike Nichols' longtime cinematographer Giuseppe Rotuno would follow the director onto Wolf, where extensive day-for-night photography allowed audiences to experience darkness through the eyes of a predator. And production designer Bo Welch aimed to give the film an overall dark and sophisticated palette while wanting to induce a sense of claustrophobia, as if the entire city was one big cage that our protagonist was clawing to escape. Oscar-winning costume designer Anne Roth brought the elegance of the Big Apple's upper class while contrasting Will's shabbier attire, although his style and fit does improve with his abilities over the course of the film. Nichols shot the film alongside his longtime editor Sam Osteen, an industry veteran who he had begun working with back in 1966, and as was their process, the director fed Osteen copious notes throughout production. Wolf, however, marked their final collaboration, the pair leaving behind a legacy that spanned 12 films in total. Understandably, Mike Nichols wanted a proven name to develop and craft the film's famed special effects. And when it came to the werewolf genre, no name stood higher than Rick Baker.
First, I really thought, why are they even coming to me? Because I was known for American Werewolf and this big transformation and all this, and that's not what this film was about, you know. And more than anything, Jack gets the benefits from being bitten by a wolf. You know, becomes more virile and more handsome and stuff. But I was intrigued. You know, I thought I liked the idea of a more subtle werewolf movie.
For the look of the werewolves, Baker was heavily influenced by the iconic work of Jack Pierce seen in 1935's Werewolf of London, which portrays a less extreme version of the werewolf. Producer Douglas Wick and director Mike Nichols wanting the makeup to merely accentuate Nicholson's naturally fierce facial features. However, because Nicholson was allergic to spirit gum, Baker had to use a particular type of medical adhesive to apply the actor's wolfy makeup to his skin, which consisted of layered hair, eye contacts, and false teeth, as well as other components depending on the character's stage of transformation. Baker also engineered a special mechanism that made Nicholson's ears twitch to indicate the onset of his superhuman abilities. Baker also fitted the star with various toupees and even suggested that Nicholson wear a temporary facelift in the later parts of the film, but the actor flat out refused this notion. Co-star James Spader had to undergo more extreme appliances in order to contend with Nicholson's signature arched brows. Animatronic replicas of both Spader and Nicholson in their demon wolf forms were also crafted by Baker, in addition to look-alike masks for the stunt performers, and an upper-body replica of Jack Nicholson for the shot where Will is impaled by the pitchfork during the final showdown. For the scene showing Will hunt and attack a deer, a combination of a real deer, a stationary dummy, and an animatronic double were used. The owl in this scene was also real, while the birds seen scattering into the night sky were computer-generated. Mike Nichols envisioned holding on a close-up of a wolf's eyes at the close of the opening scene, and turned to Academy Award-winning Hollywood effects house Studio ADI to create a full-on animatronic wolf, which was fitted with extremely complex and innovative yellow animatronic eyes, which were capable of simulating pupil dilation. The film also features the use of real wolves, provided by two of the industry's top animal trainers, although the wolf Will strikes in the opening scene was actually a German Shepherd mix. Fresh off of Jurassic Park and Schindler's List, John Williams was originally attached to score the film, but had to drop out of the project due to a delay in its production. and Nichols next turned to the prolific Italian composer Ennio Morricone. The late great musician was of course made famous for his many collaborations with director Sergio Leone, in addition to scoring countless international classics, and would be just one more lauded addition to the film's high-caliber credits. Morricone interpreted the story as a man trapped in a dark dream and sought to evoke this subconscious state in his music, delivering a haunting and moody score that adds an air of dark fantasy that sets Wolf even further apart from the typical werewolf movie. However, producer Douglas Wick grew nervous that Morricone's score would not meet audience expectations of the horror genre, and so, quite reluctantly, Mike Nichols was forced to tell the award-winning maestro that he needed to include a few more musical stings. Regardless, Morricone's score would go on to earn a 1994 Grammy nomination for Best Instrumental Composition Written for a Motion Picture, as well as becoming a Fangoria Chainsaw Award nominee for Best Soundtrack. And the composer later won the ASCAP Film and Television Top Box Office Films Music Award at the 1995 ceremony. In June 1994, the official motion picture soundtrack was made available on both CD and cassette from Columbia Records. And in 2017, a limited edition vinyl LP hit stores as part of the Ennio Morricone Classic Soundtrack series.
Wolf bit me. I don't think so, Will. You weren't there, Ralph.
Not all who are bitten change. There must be something wild within.
Early audience test screenings began in Dallas, Texas, where viewers gave mixed reactions to the film's tone, which was still very much a work in progress, and predominantly took issue with its ending, feeling it didn't pack enough punch to justify the long build-up. Therefore, the studio ordered more action shots be added to the film's stable-bound climax. But unbeknownst to them, Nichols and producer Douglas Wick had no intention of making any significant changes. In fact, according to Wick, only one shot was added to the end fight, which shows Will leaping over the bars of the stable, a shot that cost a total of $700,000 to pull off, something Mike Nichols later referred to as, quote, $700,000 worth of aspirin for the studio. Jim Harrison's original ending found a fully transformed Will being kept as a kind of pet at a secret Arctic location where Laura continued to meet with him. Other ending scenarios were considered but never shot, and ultimately the filmmaker settled on the most dramatically satisfying conclusion. However, the third act is often criticized for abandoning the more serious tone of its first two acts for over-the-top creature feature theatrics, and Douglas Wick has said that they ultimately didn't succeed in translating their highbrow concepts to the big screen, and that really, the ending is left to broad interpretation. The film's final moments, seeing Laura's eyes fade into those of a wolf's, was also the result of reshoots, Mike Nichols wanting to hammer home the message that not all transformations are a negative experience, but still wanted to end the film on an ominous note. Premiering nationwide in the United States and Canada on June 17, 1994, playing in over 2,000 theaters in the US alone, Wolf was marketed heavily in print, making the covers of such magazines as Fangoria, Premiere, Who Weekly, Imagimovies, Sci-Fi Entertainment, and Variety, in addition to 3 different movie posters, each of which focused solely on the star power of Nicholson and Pfeiffer, sporting the tagline, "The animal is out."
We just got a ransom demand from you terrorists. Says he's rigged the city bus. Where's Jack?
In its opening weekend, the film knocked 20th Century Fox's Speed out of the top spot, taking in $17.9 million, although dropped to third place the following weekend with the premiere of Walt Disney's The Lion King. The film grossed $65 million in North America and another $66 million internationally, for a worldwide gross of $131 million, making it a moderate if underwhelming box office success for Columbia Pictures. Its critical reception would also be decidedly lukewarm, many complimenting its fresh approach to tired material and injection of office politics into the werewolf mythos, and gave credit to director Mike Nichols for taking the material seriously. But others also criticized its devolution into the kind of genre films it set out to dissect. As far as audiences were concerned, the film mustered an average B cinema score in exit polling. Despite its rough rollout, Wolf managed to garner some awards attention, going on to be nominated for a total of 6 Saturn Awards by the Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror Films. And while it lost 5, awkwardly enough, both Wesley Strick and Jim Harrison would win for Best Writing. In addition to Ennio Morricone's nomination, the film gained 3 other nominations at the 1995 Fangoria Chainsaw Awards, including Best Actor for Jack Nicholson, Best Actress for Michelle Pfeiffer, and a nod for Best Wide-Release Film.
The moon is rising. The passion is growing. The animal is out. Nicholson. Pfeiffer. Wolf. From Columbia TriStar Home Video, rated R.
In late 1994, Wolf first hit the home video market as a simple VHS edition from Columbia TriStar Home Video, notable for having a slipcover whose back was a reverse of its face, but with each side featuring a different celebratory quote from critics Joel Siegel and Gene Shalit. It was later followed by a Laserdisc edition that showcased a deluxe widescreen presentation. In November 1997, the film saw its first DVD release, again from Columbia TriStar, but it offered nothing in the way of special features, and was later reissued by Sony Pictures in 2005. In June 2014, a 20th anniversary DVD was issued from Mill Creek Entertainment, but again offered no bonus material. At last, in June 2020, Wolf made its Blu-ray debut from the UK-based boutique retailer Powerhouse Films as part of their Indicator series, made available region-free, and boasted an all-new high-definition remaster of the film with both stereo and 5.1 surround sound. For the first time, this special release came with a host of bonus material, including the 2017 retrospective The Beast Inside, Creating Wolf, as well as archival behind-the-scenes footage, interviews, and more. As of 2023, however, the film has yet to see an Ultra HD release.
But at the same time, you never forgot the werewolf movies. They're very much part of us. And what's interesting is that even though scene by scene they're not so remarkable, especially when you go back and look at them, their power is greater than we thought. There's no one who hasn't seen one. There's no one who doesn't have memories of them that sort of transcend what they were. It is a powerful myth.
1994's Wolf is undoubtedly a film uncomfortable in its own skin, which is not only an ironically fitting metaphor for a werewolf movie, but also for the quietly insecure director at its helm. According to writer Wesley Strick, Mike Nichols never really understood exactly why he was making a monster movie, and that he felt the aging director merely wanted to keep himself relevant, as he had always been, and saw making a smart mainstream special effects film as his path to doing so. It's undeniable that Wolf is now seen as a bit of a black sheep in Nichols' filmography, and the same can be said for pretty much everyone else involved. A movie rarely talked about today and underappreciated in its own time. The film is a hodgepodge of themes and genres, wavering between gothic romance, a dark workplace comedy, a midlife crisis character piece, and a fangs-out monster movie. Obviously a delicate tonal balance that doesn't always feel wholly cohesive. That being said, the film offers so much more in the way of sheer entertainment, in addition to its technical prowess, that its structural and philosophical flaws are, for me anyway, more forgivable. Much like Morricone's musical interpretation, it plays like a lycanthropic fever dream that finds life outside of its more monstrous components. A film that desperately tries to be anything but just another werewolf movie, but at the end of the day, is still one hell of a werewolf movie. So let me know your thoughts on 1994's Wolf. Is it a hidden gem or a rightfully forgotten fluke of 90s Hollywood hubris? And as always, everyone, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, go ahead and click like below and feel free to share. And don't forget to find me on Patreon at /LaytonEversol. And of course, if you want to see more videos just like this one, go ahead and click subscribe.